There, the biggest news we've gotten so far on the trade front is the president appearing to announce a few minutes ago that he will be imposing a new 50% tariff on all imports of copper. Take a listen.
They like resolution, but they'd also like another. They want the right kind of resolution. They want a deal that makes sense for Canada.
We did aluminum, 50%. Lumber just came out.
Why don't you announce copper?
And we did cars. And now today we're doing copper.
At the stroke of midnight, everything changed. Without warning, Canada cut off all exports of rare earth elements, copper, and coal to the United States. The lifeline that had quietly fueled America's industries snapped in an instant. Customs officers along the Great Lakes were immediately ordered to stop every truck and train carrying ore. Freight came to a standstill. Convoy drivers were left stunned, engines idling at the border. The US government had no forewarning. The White House was caught off guard, rushing to contact Ottawa. Before dawn, the Canadian ambassador in Washington was urgently summoned. The embargo hit with the force of a geopolitical earthquake. In Washington, alarm bells rang. Pentagon officials quickly realized that a vital artery of the nation's industrial system had been severed. By morning, boardrooms across the country were in crisis mode. Executives grasped the stark reality. Critical deliveries from Canada would no longer be arriving at Detroit's auto plants or Silicon Valley's semiconductor foundries. The shockwave hit before sunrise. 2/3 of Canada's entire mineral output typically flows south to the US. That vital stream was now blocked in one swift move. These raw materials may not make headlines, but they're the backbone of modern life. Rare earth elements and the magnets derived from them power electric vehicles, semiconductors, wind turbines, and even guided missiles. Copper is essential to everything from electrical wiring to renewable energy. And coal, often overlooked, is still crucial. Over 70% of global steel production relies on it. For years, these resources were taken for granted, overlooked in the grand narrative of globalization. But a few kilograms of rare minerals can mean the difference between a functioning jet engine and a grounded aircraft. Just as the last century depended on steel and oil, this one runs on copper and rare earths. And now, these once mundane commodities have become economic weapons. The consequences across US industries were swift and severe. In Detroit, assembly lines halted as automakers ran out of essential materials. Electric vehicles can't be built without copper and rare earth magnets. Steel mills from Pennsylvania to Illinois faced supply shortages as Canadian coal stopped arriving, threatening delays in construction and manufacturing. In Gary, Indiana, a blast furnace that had operated without pause for decades was shut down due to a lack of coal. Semiconductor factories, already stretched thin, faced new disruptions without access to critical minerals needed for high-tech production. Renewable energy projects, from wind farms to battery plants, were suddenly thrown into uncertainty. By the end of the week, production lines in several factories simply stopped. The gears of America's industrial engine began to grind slower, starved of the materials that once flowed freely. The impact on the high-tech sector was just as serious. From smartphones and data centers to advanced chips, modern tech depends on obscure metals, many sourced from Canada or other countries. In Silicon Valley, executives warned that without ultra-pure copper and specialized minerals, the rollout of 5G networks and cloud infrastructure could be delayed. Cutting-edge semiconductors rely on exotic materials like gallium, germanium, and dysprosium, all now caught in the crisis. Suddenly, tech firms found themselves looking into mining permits and stockpiles instead of product launches and software updates. The supply chain fragility had shifted from the factory floor to the digital frontier. Delays in next-gen EVS, AI systems, and cloud tech loomed. Innovation itself was under threat. For American workers, the pain hit early and hard. In Ohio, a welder woke to a text message. His shift was canceled indefinitely. As materials dried up, factories began furloughing employees. Automakers and heavy equipment companies announced sudden layoffs within days. And, as industrial output slowed, the shock spread to Main Street. Prices began to rise. The cost of building a home, buying a car, or even a can of soda jumped as essential raw inputs became scarce. At the same time, paychecks shrank. The middle class was hit with a painful 1-2 punch of job insecurity and rising costs. Economists warned the shortages and inflation would have ripple effects across the entire economy. Households began to feel the pressure. Monthly bills rose. Grocery prices ticked up. Rent became harder to manage. What started as a trade disruption quickly became personal, a sudden, invisible tax on everyday life. "We survived the chip shortage," said one manufacturing executive. "But this feels different. It's like an earthquake under our supply chain." In industrial towns across the Midwest, the abstract crisis became all too real. In one Ohio steel town, a mill that had run nonstop for generations was forced to shut down, putting hundreds of workers on furlough. Nearby businesses suffered almost immediately. The diner next to the plant had empty tables during lunch. A local hardware store owner began extending credit to longtime customers who were suddenly out of work. "It's like the early 1980s all over again," said a laid-off steelworker, recalling a time of deep economic hardship. A geopolitical move had arrived in small-town America, and the human cost was growing by the day. For years, the US had embraced a confrontational America First trade policy under Donald Trump, targeting even close allies. Tariffs were slapped on Canadian steel and aluminum in the name of national security. Trump once claimed the US had nothing to gain from Canada, implying it was entirely self-sufficient. The strategy was clear: use pressure and tariffs to force manufacturing back to US soil by punishing foreign imports. But now, that same playbook was backfiring. Canada's retaliatory move laid bare how dependent US factories still were on integrated North American supply chains. The very tariffs meant to protect American industry had driven its closest supplier to pull the plug. And now, Washington found itself with no quick alternative. These critical Canadian resources couldn't simply be replaced overnight. Rather than securing American self-sufficiency, the trade war had weakened the continent's shared industrial foundation. The price was being paid not in policy papers, but in layoffs, production shutdowns, and growing anxiety from coast to coast. Trump, furious at the fallout, lashed out, declaring that Canada should be America's 51st state. But his bluster only strengthened Ottawa's resolve. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers were outraged. Emergency hearings were convened as officials demanded answers about how the US had stumbled into such a massive strategic vulnerability. At the Pentagon, concern turned to outright fear. America's most advanced weapon systems rely heavily on the very minerals that had just been cut off. Each F-35 stealth fighter contains nearly 900 pounds of rare earth metals in its engines and onboard sensors. A single Arleigh Burke-class destroyer requires more than 5,000 pounds of rare earth materials. A Virginia-class submarine? Over 9,000. From tungsten used in armor-piercing shells to gallium in radar systems, America's defense contractors depend on a global supply chain rooted in foreign mines. More than 75% of US military hardware includes components made with these critical minerals, and over 95% of America's rare earths are imported. Now, those imports were in jeopardy. Lockheed Martin quietly issued warnings about possible delays in fighter jet deliveries. Military leaders cautioned that if no new sources were found quickly, the production of missiles, aircraft, and satellites could grind to a halt. The US strategic reserve of critical minerals was already running dangerously low, hardly a safety net. What began as a supply chain problem had rapidly morphed into a national security emergency. Meanwhile, the rest of the world moved swiftly to seize the opportunity. Germany wasted no time in securing Canadian rare earths and copper to supply its industries. Across the Pacific, Japan and South Korea sent top officials to Ottawa, racing to lock in long-term supply deals for batteries and semiconductors. China, already known for weaponizing its control over rare earths, saw an opening. Chinese state media mocked the US, claiming it was now learning a hard lesson from one of its closest allies, no less. Strategists in Beijing openly marveled that America was being crippled without a single shot being fired. China began positioning itself as a more reliable partner for resource-rich nations, while the US looked increasingly isolated. In a matter of weeks, Canada's quiet role as a friendly neighbor had shifted. It was now seen as a crucial player at the center of global resource diplomacy. While America watched from the sidelines, allies and rivals alike secured the very materials the US had assumed would always be within reach. Global markets reeled. Commodity prices soared as uncertainty spread. Copper futures hit record highs, breaking $5 a pound and rising more than 40% since the start of the year in a frenzy of panic buying. Prices for rare earth oxides spiked, echoing the chaos of previous supply shocks. Investors scrambled for safe assets. Gold prices hit historic levels, while industrial stocks tanked. Wall Street took a pounding. The Dow and S&P 500 logged their worst drops of the year. Economists began warning of a resource-driven recession, and major banks slashed their growth forecasts. Economic confidence evaporated. The sheer unpredictability of the trade rupture was freezing corporate investment across the country. By late summer, hundreds of billions of dollars in market value had vanished. The fear was palpable, from Wall Street boardrooms to pension funds on Main Street. Ordinary Americans were finally starting to wake up to the scale of the crisis. Suddenly, critical minerals became a household term. Evening news segments and newspaper front pages blared alerts. People began to question what actually went into their smartphones, their EVS, their laptops. For the first time, the average consumer was learning that their daily tech relied on fragile global supply chains. The issue became deeply personal. Talk radio shows compared it to the 1970s oil shock. Teachers were explaining rare earths in high school economics classes. Social media exploded with commentary, and formerly obscure fields like geology and mining engineering suddenly became viral topics. Geologists and mineral analysts found themselves turned into unexpected influencers. A subject that once lived only in academic journals and technical reports had entered the mainstream. The underlying message was clear: the modern world runs on minerals, and the foundation was far shakier than anyone had realized. For Canada, this crisis marked a turning point. Once overshadowed by its much larger neighbor, Canada emerged as a global resource superpower. It was already America's largest supplier of uranium, potash, and other essential materials. Now, it wielded its natural resources as tools of diplomacy and leverage. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't hold back. He called Trump's tariff blitz an attack on Canadian workers, families, and businesses, and vowed that retaliatory tariffs would stay in place until the Americans show us respect. Gone was the era of quiet diplomacy. Politicians of all stripes stood together in defense of Canadian sovereignty. A wave of national pride swept across the country. Citizens who once joked about living in America's shadow were now cheering their government's defiance. Carney received a standing ovation in Parliament after declaring Canada never, ever will be part of America. The message couldn't be clearer. Canada would not be bullied, and it would not serve as a mere warehouse of resources for its southern neighbor. Back in Washington, the crisis sparked a bitter reckoning. After decades of outsourcing and an obsession with just-in-time logistics, the US was simply not prepared to operate on its own. In response, officials scrambled to invoke emergency laws, pouring funds into domestic mines, refineries, and factories. But building an industrial base from scratch is neither quick nor easy. New mines take years to develop. Smelters can't be erected overnight. Environmental regulations and a shortage of skilled labor only made things harder. Desperate to fill the gap, the US turned to allies, attempting to fast-track deals with Australia, Norway, and other resource-rich nations. Still, nothing could be built fast enough. In Texas, a new rare earth magnet factory promised just 1,000 tons of output per year, barely a drop in the bucket compared to China's production. Some American companies even considered shifting operations overseas just to secure the raw materials they needed. A painful irony, given that the trade policies were intended to bring manufacturing home. The threat of deindustrialization once again loomed large. We may be heading toward a future where factories don't shut down because of a lack of demand, but because they simply run out of the raw materials needed to operate. Not since the 1970s, oil embargo has the United States faced a supply shock of this scale. That earlier crisis, driven by a cartel's grip on petroleum, led to the creation of strategic oil reserves, energy efficiency laws, and new drilling initiatives. But building resilience for critical minerals is an even more complex challenge. Instead of one major resource like oil, the US must now secure dozens of essential elements, many of which have no easy substitutes if their supply is cut off. Unlike petroleum, which is globally traded and relatively easy to store, rare metals like lithium and neodymium are found in just a handful of places. Their extraction is complicated, costly, and often environmentally damaging. As the world shifts away from fossil fuels and toward clean energy, we're not eliminating dependency. We're simply replacing one with another. Petroleum is being swapped for lithium. Natural gas is being traded for cobalt. And yet, proposals to open new mines on American soil face intense environmental and political resistance. Meanwhile, the demand for these materials continues to climb. The lessons of history are clear. Any nation that cannot secure reliable access to vital resources leaves its economy exposed to those who can. In Washington, the mineral crisis began to reshape national policy thinking. Experts in policy circles proposed bold new strategies, such as forming an international alliance, a kind of NATO for natural resources, to help friendly countries coordinate and protect supply chains. Other ideas, once considered radical, started gaining traction. Nationalizing critical mines, mandating national stockpiles, and even subsidizing electronics recycling to recover usable metals. The idea of urban mining, reclaiming rare materials from old smartphones, laptops, and batteries, started to gain serious momentum. Turning trash into treasure became a strategic priority. The line between economic policy and national security blurred. Ensuring access to lithium, nickel, neodymium, and similar elements became as vital as securing oil was in the 20th century. Globally, the pressure was building for the US and Canada to find a resolution. European and Asian allies, heavily dependent on North American supply chains, quietly urged both sides to come to terms before the fallout worsened. A special emergency session of the G7 was called, where officials warned that a prolonged shutdown of Canadian mineral exports could derail global economic recovery. The European Union even stepped in, offering to mediate and help allocate scarce materials among friendly nations. It was a striking moment. Rarely had a dispute between two close allies carried such global implications. The episode revealed just how fragile and interconnected the world's industrial system has become. The standoff also raised urgent questions about the future of globalization and national sovereignty. In the last century, nations fought over oil. In this one, they're racing to secure lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. Back in 1992, China's Deng Xiaoping famously said, "The Middle East has oil. China has rare earths." That prophecy has now come to life. The once invisible materials that power modern life have become tools of geopolitical power. This crisis exposed a painful truth. By prioritizing cost efficiency and speed above all else, many democracies have left themselves dangerously exposed. What use is a cheap smartphone or electric car if the materials needed to build it can be cut off overnight? The global supply chain, once celebrated for its seamless efficiency, has revealed its greatest vulnerability. It can be used as a weapon. This mineral showdown marked a turning point, ushering in a new era shaped not just by technology or politics, but by the very elements beneath our feet. The battle over resources has already begun. And it's not just between superpowers. The race for critical minerals is now focused on the global south. Countries with rich, untapped deposits, from South America's lithium salt flats to Africa's cobalt and nickel reserves, are suddenly in the spotlight. They are being courted by competing powers eager to secure supply. Nations like Chile, Indonesia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo now hold powerful bargaining chips. But they also face intense pressure. The question for these countries is whether this mineral rush will finally bring real development and stronger national sovereignty, or simply trap them in a new cycle of exploitation and foreign control. Leaders in these regions insist this time will be different. They aim to use their buried wealth on their own terms, with a promise not to become pawns in someone else's game. They hope to turn mineral riches into long-term prosperity, not just short-term deals. As the dust settles, one thing is clear: the old rules no longer apply. The assumption that raw materials will always be available is gone. The global economy is being forced to confront new realities. How does a superpower like the United States, so long accustomed to abundance, adapt to a world defined by scarcity? Will nations cooperate to ensure stability? Or will they hoard, scheme, and scramble for self-sufficiency? And perhaps most crucially, will the next great conflict be fought not over territory or ideology, but over the periodic table? These are the questions that will shape the balance of power for decades to come. From corporate boardrooms to military strategy rooms, one thing is certain: plans are being rewritten to prepare for a future where resources are limited and trust among nations is wearing thin.